Checo Perez has signed an extension with Red Bull through 2026. Laz, I'll start with you. Right call by Red Bull?
Well, Red Bull had a lot of options. It felt like going into here. They're clearly the top team under this current regulation set. Whether that will continue into 2026 is a big question that's wide open, which is also why we have all this speculation around Max Verstappen. But what they've done is they've gone for a bit of stability there. Of course, they want to keep Max. That's their number one priority, and he is contracted through to 2028. And by keeping Checo there, I think they'll keep Max happy. Max likes the idea of being teammates with Checo. So far, there's been a few little fireworks along the way, but it's been pretty one-sided. So Max will know that as long as he's at that team and that team is competitive, he's the one that's going to be leading it. So I think there's a little bit of that. I guess they know what they're getting with Checo. It's not always great, but it is fairly consistent. If you bring someone else into the mix, there's a number of really good drivers out on the market. Carlos Sainz, Esteban Ocon, we'll talk about him in a bit, but there's a few drivers which you could bring in, but would you destabilize the team? And I think that was something they really didn't want, considering how unstable that team has been so far this year. So I can kind of understand the logic behind it. But what's interesting is that if you look at the championship this year, we went into this year thinking, well, Red Bull have such a big car advantage. There's no way they're not going to win both championships at a canter. Do we even need to tune in for 24 races a year? And now you look at the Constructors' Championship, and I think the gap is 24 points. And the reason for that is because Ferrari have two exceptional drivers in Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz, both haven't scored a win, kind of against the odds, I suppose, to some extent this year. And Red Bull, where if you look at where they're dropping points is with Checo. Also, that this comes after two pretty disappointing results for Checo as well, is interesting. But that also goes to show that these decisions aren't based on, what happened at the last race or even what's happened at the last three races. They're long-term decisions based on a number of factors. And I think a big one of these is just that stability going forward.
Are you guys surprised, Nate, that it was 2 years as compared to maybe a 1-1 situation?
Yeah, that's what stood out in the announcement. And usually teams can be quite clever with that. When it is a 1+1 or a 2+1, you get the language of kind of multi-year deal or has or just sometimes it's just will stay with the team beyond 2024. It can be that vague. So I was surprised by that, and I was actually told in Monaco by somebody who's pretty well connected with the team that it was a 1+1 deal. And it's kind of been a sticking point, I think, for Perez. He's wanted that stability for obvious reasons. You have a 1+1 deal. It's effectively a 1-year contract because that 1-year extension is on the side of the team. And you have to basically prove to them again, you're worth that second season. And that's just not a good situation to be in. A lot of drivers say when they're on that kind of deal, it's difficult to stay focused. I mean, that was a big thing for Bottas. If you remember in the Mercedes days with Lewis, he kept getting 1-year deals and he just was constantly basically in the same cycle of he'd sign a new deal, he'd have a few months where he wasn't asked about it. Then January the 1st came around and everyone was just asking about his contract again. So you can see how it becomes an issue for drivers. What is interesting, if it is 2 years, and I've checked in with Red Bull just to be like, hey, have you worded this or is this 2 years? And what they're saying is, no, this is a 2-year contract. What's interesting with that is that from everything that all the conversations Lawrence and I have had in the paddock, is we know Carlos Sainz wanted this seat above anything else for, again, obvious reasons, right? Keeps him at the front end of the grid. What Red Bull said was the sticking point there was he wanted a long-term contract with Red Bull. They weren't willing to give him that. They were like, well, here's a 1-year deal. Sainz said, no, I've signed plenty of those short deals in my past. I want something longer. We know that Williams has now emerged as, potential landing spot for him. And I think this deal will probably mean we know where Sainz is going to go sooner rather than later. So it's interesting they've gone for 2 years. And it does speak to the point that Lawrence made about keeping Max Verstappen happy. You get a driver in who he likes working with, who I don't think really causes any headaches behind the scenes, really. And I'm not saying Carlos Sainz is renowned for being a bad teammate, far from it. But I think you put someone like Carlos Sainz in there, you're adding an unknown in. You're adding a guy. Yeah, and you're adding a guy in Sainz who still believes he can be world champion, I think. A guy who has really only just recently had his breakthrough in the last couple of seasons. Perez, with the greatest respect to Perez, I think that's kind of been beaten out of him a little bit, again, to use the Bottas example, like it was with him at Mercedes. So you have that kind of driver who knows, like, hey, this is a pretty cushy situation. I'm not going to win the championship, but I'm still going to be driving one of the best cars in Formula One. I think that you keep that guy in the team. Sainz could just be such a destabilizing presence at a time, as we know, when things behind the scenes at Red Bull have been far from calm for a while. So yeah, it did surprise me in the wording of it, but the more you look into it, and I think the Max factor, keeping him happy, if they looked at it and said, right, if we give Perez a 2-year deal, it potentially helps us keep Max down the line. We know that Max potentially, has kind of looked at the Mercedes option going forward. Then it makes a lot of sense on that side. But yeah, it's very interesting because it kind of locks down where they're at for a couple of seasons if other drivers become available. So not the duration I was expecting at all.
Thanks so much for watching ESPN on YouTube. And for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app. And for premium content and live streaming, subscribe to ESPN Plus.